Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name's Ishi. I hope you've all been well. Today I am going to talk about 10 books I read recently. These are most of the books I read in March and April and some also in May. I haven't really been filming that many reading vlogs or reading updates recently, but I have been reading, thankfully. I am no longer in my reading slump, so I'm super excited to talk about some of these books. So getting right into it and starting off quite easy with the Hunger Games trilogy, I read The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay, all of which I loved and gave 5 stars to. I have read the series once before in middle school and I really loved it, but I also didn't really remember it that well, which is why I decided to reread it. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it because it's The Hunger Games, it's amazing, and I think I also talked about them in a few reading vlogs that I did, but I do have a few thoughts that I do want to talk about in this wrap-up. Back when I was a kid in middle school, I read it and I liked it. I didn't really think much of it, but reading it now, I realized how much more political and thought-provoking this series really is. And some of the fighting scenes too were a whole lot more gory than I remember them being. Anyway, love these books, love the movies, love everything about The Hunger Games. Or so I thought, until I read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I wouldn't say I hated this book, but I came very close to hating this book. This book follows President Snow, Coriolanus, let's call him, and he is very young. He's just out of school, and back then these were some of the first Hunger Games ever. And this is the first year where each of the tributes are gonna have a mentor, except instead of having a mentor from their district, they are gonna have a mentor from the capital. So every district's mentor is like a newly graduate student from this school at the capital. And Coriolanus ends up being the mentor to the girl from District 12. Her name is Lucy Gray. I decided to read this because I obviously love the Hunger Games trilogy, as we established, and also there is going to be a movie coming out for the Songbirds and Snakes. I watched the trailer and everything and it looked super cool, so I was like, maybe it's time for me to read this book, because I have been putting it off for a really long time because honestly I was not that interested in President Snow's story. And while Snow is the main character, this book isn't supposed to make us sympathize with him. This book is only supposed to highlight how twisted and terrible he really is, which I think was the downfall of this book for me, because Snow is just so dislikable that I did not want to read about him. I wanted to just stop reading. If Coriolanus hadn't been so dislikable from the very beginning, if we got to see a bit of a hero to villain transition storyline, then maybe I would have liked this book a whole lot more than I did. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy for Coriolanus in this book, so I was uninterested from the very beginning, and my disinterest only grew as he turned out to be the most insufferable character ever for the rest of the book as well. And I get that we're supposed to notice all these flaws, but he was also so mind-numbingly boring that I had such a tough time finishing this book. And his inner monologue just grated against my nerves for the entirety of the book, and I was so sick of him. This book is about the very beginning of Snow's storyline, and I honestly was not that interested, as I have said. From the original series, we know that he poisoned and lied his way to the top, and I would have loved to see, more of the poisoning, more of the lying and all that political maneuvering, which we didn't get to see in this book at all. And like I mentioned, I think I would have loved this book way more if he was written as a likable and charismatic character rather than just being so insufferable. One thing I really loved about this book was seeing how a lot of the things connected back to the original series, like Lucy Gray being from District 12 obviously, and being that rebel sort of figure, and we can see why President Snow really ends up hating Katniss because she obviously reminds him of Lucy Gray. The Mockingjays, the song that Katniss sings for Rue, the hanging tree. After reading this book, I think I have a much better idea of what Snow must have thought of Katniss, even though it's never really brought up, obviously, because this is set way back in the past. Overall, this book did fall a bit flat for me and I did not like it, which is why I gave it 2 stars. I will watch the movie though. The next book I'll talk about is The Hacienda, which is a retelling of Rebecca, and it's described as Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. I haven't read Mexican Gothic, but I have read Rebecca, and it's one of my most favorite books ever, which is why I was really looking forward to reading this. Our main character is Beatrice, and she marries this really handsome politician named Don Rodolfo, even though he has a lot of sketchy rumors surrounding him. And after getting married, she moves with him back to his home, this ginormous estate which she is really looking forward to making her own, but it's not quite the sanctuary she expected it to be. because it's haunted. I love that this book had a paranormal aspect to it because the paranormal aspect is everything that I wanted from Rebecca, and this book has it. I absolutely love this book. I ended up giving it 5 stars. And yes, on the surface, I can categorize this book as a retelling of Rebecca, but this book was so much more than just that. I love Beatrice and I loved our cast of other, supporting main characters too, like Andres and Paloma. They were all so well written, and even though we only get to know them for a really short period of time, I feel like I understand them really well. The paranormal part of the story was just the right amount of scary and dramatic, and I loved it. And I might talk about a few spoilers ahead, so beware. Andres is like a Catholic priest, but he comes from this very like witchy background. His grandmother was a witch, and now he knows all this witchcraft, and the people of the village come to him for his witchcraft. And I found his story to be very fascinating, and I loved how integral he was to the plot. I love the dynamic between Andres and Beatrice. I think the both of them suit each other very well. But what I loved about this book is that the two of them don't end up together. They kind of go their own ways and live their own lives, but maybe there's a possibility that they will end up together in the future, and I liked that this book left that open-ended. And yes, I know that Beatrice is married to Don Rodolfo, but that is not the point. I mean, maybe it's the point, but Andres, it's one of those books that you have to read for yourself and experience for yourself because I really can't explain it well enough. All I can say is that I loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I want to talk about is Heart of the Sun Warrior, which is book 2 after Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I don't know if you know this about me, but I hate romance in fantasy books. I am a hater. I despise it, in fact. If I am enjoying a good fantasy book and all of a sudden romance comes up, I am gagging, throwing up, feeling physically ill. However, this book did romance right. I'm gonna give a spoiler-free summary here. In this book, we follow Xingyin, who is the daughter of the moon goddess, and she is technically not supposed to be born. The empire doesn't know about her, and she is a secret and lives with her mother on the moon. And all of this is like the first book, by the way. So still, in the first book, the emperor finds out about her and she must escape. So she runs away from the moon and hides in I don't know what the exact place was, but she hides in the same place where the emperor and the empress and they all live. And she ends up becoming really close to the emperor's son, the prince. His name is Li Wei. She studies alongside Li Wei and she ends up joining this army sort of thing, and her captain is Wenjie. And there's this whole love triangle situation going on between her, Li Wei, and Wenjie. In this book, she's back living with her mother on the moon and something else happens and she is forced to flee. I cannot fully explain what I think about this book without talking about spoilers, so spoiler warning ahead for this book and the previous book as well. So back to that love triangle, at the end of the last book, so at the end of Daughter of the Moon Goddess, Wenjie betrays Xingyin in the worst way possible, and she wants nothing to do with him ever again, which sucks because he was hot. How do I know this? I just know. She has this sort of relationship going with Li Wei, but at the same time, she still has feelings for Wenjie, even though he is this terrible person in her head. It was honestly a little bit frustrating to read because I just wanted her to make a decision. I mean, at the end of the day, both of them are great, and I hated how wishy-washy she was being with both of them. And then throughout this book, Wenjie slowly starts to come back into her life, and she starts to realize how amazing he is. Or maybe that's just me, maybe I'm projecting, but anyway, he's amazing and she starts to realize this, and then she's suddenly questioning her whole future with Li Wei, which she's not sure she wants anymore. And then Li Wei's mother is threatening her and trying to bribe her into leaving Li Wei alone, which I didn't like because I'm honestly kind of over the whole evil mother-in-law sort of trope. And yes, I know Li Wei's mother is in no way Xingyin's mother-in-law, but that's kind of the vibe I got because Li Wei did want to marry Xingyin, but his mother did not want her to marry him. The three of them go on this quest together, so Li Wei, Wenjie, and Xingyin have to work together, all the while she's dealing with her messy feelings, and Li Wei and Wenjie have to get along even though they don't like each other whatsoever. And then, spoiler warning, Wenjie dies. And I was devastated because I was like, oh man, they're gonna use this as an excuse to make Xingyin end up with Li Wei because Wenjie is dead. And I was honestly like, I cried. I'm crying now. And now I'm literally about to explain the end of the book, so beware. Xinyin is never happy again. She is off on her own little journey trying to find Wenjie even though he's dead, but she's just trying to come to peace with his death. And then she finds out that he actually got reincarnated as a mortal thanks to Li Wei, because Li Wei is like the emperor now and he has the power to do so. So Wenjie is living as a mortal. I'm overwhelmed. He's living as a mortal and she goes and finds him and she is ready to kind of get to know him again even though he doesn't remember her, and they are gonna live happily ever after. I did not explain it very well, but I am not joking when I say that this is one of my most favorite endings ever. I loved it. I cannot explain how much I loved this ending. I cannot explain how happy I am that Xingyin does not end up with Li Wei, because whew. I will say that the pacing was odd at times and all of the really important battles ended way too quickly. Like, they almost seemed inconsequential because they ended so quickly. But anyway, I didn't care about any of that because my Wenjie and Xingyin loving heart was so full. I need a spin-off, I need whatever, a sequel with Xingyin and Wenjie's life as mortals or whatever else, and them getting to know each other again. Anyway, I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I'll talk about is Dune, which I read because I loved the movie, which I watched because Timothée Chalamet was in it, and I am not above being a Timothée Chalamet fangirl. And I realized that there were probably a lot of things that the movie did not cover, which is also why I decided to read the book. Our main character is Paul, and he is heir to a noble family who rules Arrakis, and Arrakis is this desert planet where the only thing of value is a spice. But then his family, House Atreides, is betrayed and him and his mother end up going on the run. And this book follows their journey. I really liked the storyline and I really liked the characters, but I did not like the writing style, which I will say is a product of its time. This is a really old book and you can tell that it was written like a really long time ago. It feels stuffy and overcomplicated. And no doubt the world building is a masterpiece, but it's just a little hard to digest with the way it's explained. So the whole premise of the book is that Paul is supposed to be this like savior sort of person, and the Fremen, who are the native people of the planet Arrakis, consider him to be like this messiah that has been prophesized, and they were waiting for him. And I really did not like that because him and his mother are obviously like very white coded, so the whole like messiah thing is like a white savior type of thing, and I did not enjoy reading it, especially because the Fremen are very like POC coded, and specifically there is a lot in this book that's taken out of Arab culture and Islamic faith, and it's just kind of like mishmashed together with all this other stuff and not very properly, I will have to say. Not that I know, because I am not like of that faith or culture, but I feel like it's appropriation to some degree. I found it very odd that these Fremen would have some prophecy of these white saviors coming from nowhere and saving their people. Paul fully leans into this role like a concerning amount, and as much as I liked him at the beginning of the book and as much as I wanted to continue liking him throughout, I just could not. I also don't like Paul's mother for the exact same reason. Also, her name's Jessica. Like, why is her name Jessica in this like sci-fi-ish book? Like, really, their names are Jessica and Paul? What I do know about this book is that Paul is not supposed to be like a hero. He's supposed to be this like person who develops into this really terrible character, and I was interested in seeing how he would progress because I did like him at the very beginning of the book, and by the end of the book he definitely developed into a character I really did not like at all that much. So overall I had very conflicting feelings about this book. I did not love it, I did not hate it. It's just kind of like, you know, like I read it, it was okay. I ended up giving it 3 stars. And I was interested in seeing where the series would go, which is why I also picked up Dune Messiah, the second book. Dune Messiah does not pick up where Dune left off. In fact, this book takes place 12 years later, and Paul is emperor and has been for several years. And he's not a good emperor. Compared to the first one, I did not like this book. The first book was exciting because things were unknown and we were getting to know this world and know these characters. We followed Paul and Jessica and were immersed in their story. This book was very different. It kind of felt like I was far away from the characters, and instead of being immersed into their story, it kind of felt like I was watching them through this glass. All the characters, even ones that we knew in the first book, felt like strangers to me just because of that huge time skip. Dune was about Paul's rise to power, and this book was about his downfall. We never get to see him be an actual good leader, which I didn't like because Dune kind of made me want to root for him a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And I would have liked to see him try and be a good leader for at least a little while before, getting into his downfall. Overall, I feel like this book really didn't have that much substance to it, and I might get into a few spoilers here, so proceed with caution. Paul was betrayed in this book, but he is such an aloof character throughout the book that I didn't really care about anyone that betrayed him, because it seemed like he himself didn't care about the betrayals. In the first book, Duncan Idaho dies, but in this book, he is brought back to life, but again, I didn't see the point. I also don't like people coming back to life after they're dead in general, and don't mention a single thing about Wenja from Heart of the Sun Warrior, because that's a completely different case. Paul also randomly loses his eyesight in an explosion, and I also don't see the point of it. I know it was supposed to make this statement about how he still has his vision without his eyes, because he gets these visions, like dreams, and he can kind of foretell the future, and even though he didn't have his working eyes anymore, he can still kind of see. And at that point, I feel like his character was worshipped enough by all of these religious fanatics that there really was no point to adding another thing on top of this pile of things about Paul that people worshipped and loved. And at the end of the book, Cheney, his person that he has been having an affair with this whole time, gives birth to 2 kids. And instead of fathering them, he just goes off into the desert to die. And I'm not exaggerating. He's like, I'm just gonna go now. I'm not going to be a part of these kids' lives. I'm just going to go and die. So I don't understand the importance of anything that happens in this book. It's kind of pointless to me. And I feel like all of this book is just like a setup for what's coming in the 3rd book. Overall, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I ended up giving it 2 stars. The next book I'll talk about is House on the Strand, which I started reading because Connor talked about it on his channel, and I'll link his channel below. We follow this guy named Dick, who has a friend named Magnus Lane, who is a professor. And Magnus has been doing all this research and experiments with these drugs that can send a person back in time. So if you take these drugs and walk around, physically you're still walking around in present day, but you're seeing what you would have seen hundreds of years in the past. So your body is in the present and your mind is in the past. This book is also written by Daphne du Maurier, who also wrote Rebecca, which is one of my most favorite books ever, so I had to read this. I unfortunately did not enjoy it that much. I liked it enough, I gave it 3 stars. Our main character, Richard, also known as Dick, is very unlikable. He does not like his wife. It seems like he doesn't even want to be married to her. He does not like his stepsons. And overall, I found his attitude towards his wife and family and their family friends to be very irritating. Because why is he married to this perfectly likable woman if he dislikes her so much? He is obsessed with his friend Magnus. He's in love with Magnus, even though we never see Magnus on page. Magnus is like this abstract presence throughout this book. And Richard and Magnus's relationship seemed to me one of the most interesting thing about this book, so I would have loved to see it actually on page. So Richard is basically taking these drugs and going back to the past. There were quite a lot of characters that we got to meet in the past timeline, and they are all interconnected in some way. I honestly cannot remember their names or how they are related to each other. And honestly, we learned so much about them that I would have never cared to know, that I honestly can't even be bothered to remember. After getting back from the past into the present timeline, Richard spends a lot of time researching all these people that he gets to see in the past. And also, while he is in the past, Richard can't interact with them. So he's just kind of like a fly on the wall watching these people live their lives. So I wasn't really interested, just because he was so not connected to this past storyline at all. He was just kind of watching it all unfold and happen. And he's going to the past and getting back to the present, and he's talking about how the geography has changed and how there's a barn over here and the barn didn't used to be there in the past. Yes, that mansion over there used to belong to so-and-so family, and those hills over there were different, and it was just so boring to me. I did not care. About halfway through, the book does pick up, and I was more interested in the plot after the halfway point of the story. So the pacing was weird because the first half of this book was kind of slow and not much happened. And while I love open endings, I wish that the end of this book had been more definitive. Overall, it was okay, but I didn't like it all that much. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book I'll talk about is The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. This is kind of a retelling of the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective, except Penelope is dead and she is retelling her story from the underworld as she remembers it. Penelope also had these 12 maids who Odysseus executed, and these 12 maids are also also dead, obviously, and they are also telling their part of the story from the underworld. And I found this whole premise to be fascinating. But after finishing this book, I'm gonna be honest, I was a little underwhelmed. I loved the first half of this book and I was really excited to read the rest, but my excitement kind of tapered off because I did not like the portrayal of Penelope. She seemed very bland to me. In the beginning of the book, she talks about how she is more than the poets made her out to be, and no one really knows her story, and the poets didn't do her justice, and the poets are always just talking about the men and talking about Odysseus and never really telling her story how she wanted it to be told. And she said now it's finally time for her to tell her story how she would want it to be told. And the way she told her story was so disappointing to me that I think the original Odyssey did her more justice than she did herself in this story. She just whined and complained about Helen of Troy, about how Helen was so beautiful and she was just an ugly duckling. It kind of felt like I was reading a middle schooler's diary, like she was just whining. There were some chapters we spent in the underworld and I really liked these. I loved seeing how all these mythological figures adapted to the modern world, because the underworld setting happened in modern day, because it's been so many years into the future and Penelope is finally telling her story about the past, so the underworld storyline is kind of modern day. While I didn't like Penelope all that much, I did love the 12 Maids, and I love all of the 12 Maids chapters because they told their story in songs, so like in verse. I loved all of the songs and the poems. Outside of the songs, I didn't really care much for the writing style. If the entire story had been written in verse, I would have loved it so much, but overall it just wasn't for me. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The last book I'll talk about is The Final Gambit, which is the third and last book in the Inheritance Games series. The series is about Avery, who is this random girl who seemingly wins the fortune of the Hawthorne family. So Tobias Hawthorne, this like grandpa, dies and he leaves everything to Avery, even though she does not think she's related to this family in any way. And he has all these stipulations that to win all of this money, she must live in the Hawthorne house for like a year. And in this book, that year is almost up. So she is almost about to become like one of the richest people on earth by inheriting all this money. I don't know about this book. It was fun, but I didn't like it at the same time. There were a bunch of games and puzzles that Avery had to solve to kind of figure out this whole mystery. And while they were interesting, they were so unrealistic. And spoiler warning, there is this old man, I forget his name, but he had a grudge against Tobias Hawthorne, and he is basically trying to sabotage Avery from getting this whole fortune. And he basically agrees to play like a series of chess games with her, and I don't know, he agrees to a series of chess games, and if he loses then he'll back off. You're telling me that an old man with a generations long grudge against this family is going to agree to end his vendetta against this family just because he lost a game of chess and has honor enough to respect that? Like, come on. There's also this girl named Eve who is the daughter of Tobias Hawthorne Jr., so like the dead Tobias Hawthorne's son. I really didn't like her from the very beginning. She shows up and Grayson starts following her around like a little puppy. Like, yes, we get it, Grayson. She looks like Emily. I also don't like Emily. Just grow a spine, stop following this girl around. There was also a love triangle going on because Avery was dating Jameson, but she always had this bit of tension with Grayson because she had a thing with him in the past books. And I just think it's so unnecessary. Because, like, I get it. You know, I get it. But I don't get it, actually. Because Grayson and Jameson are brothers. Like, you can't... It was gross to me. Like, I did not like this love triangle at all. And then there's Avery's best friend, Max, who I despise. I hate her. I'm a hater. And I just hate her. I had to take a star away from this book because of her. I ended up giving this book 2 stars. If Max was not in it, I would have given it 3 stars. But she is just that annoying. 2 stars, I did not like it. It was like, I don't know, it wasn't really my thing. Anyway, those are some of the books I read recently. Please let me know if you've read them, what you thought of them. Please let me know what you've been reading recently. I kind of have been saying at the end of every video I post that I will start to post more regularly, but I just have been absolutely failing. But this time I'll try really hard to put out weekly videos. I kind of fell out of love with YouTube for a while. I did not enjoy the whole filming, editing. I just decided to take a break for a while, but I think now I am sort of getting back into enjoying it and I can do it without, you know, hating every single minute of it. So this time, please hold me accountable. I did start a new job, which has been fun. Anyway, my name's Ishi. Thanks for spending time with me and I hope your day is as wonderful as you are.